a lot of their due time. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This is the Kentucky Book Festival. This is the UK Healthcare Writers Room. My name is Parker Van Houten. I'm a fifth-year senior down the street at the University of Kentucky, and I'm very happy to be here today. We have a very special panel here for you today. Our first guest is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, holds degrees from Yale University and the College of William Mary. Please help me in welcoming Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle. Our next guest is an award-winning writer, poet, and playwright who teaches creative writing and English at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. Please welcome Angela Jackson Brown. And last but certainly not least, he is a retired national business attorney, was raised in the small town of Pilot Mountain in the Piedmont foothills of North Carolina. Please give a warm welcome to Michael A. Almond.
That's that. We go now. Okay. Well, this is about the craft of writing historical fiction. And one of the most important things about writing historical fiction is publishing it and then selling it. So I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the three novels that are the work product of the three people on this stage are available downstairs, and we will be signing copies of them afterwards, even as we breathe, the Tannery, and When Stars Rain Down. So be sure to check them out. We're at the fiction table back in the horseshoe at the back of things. So we have a very diverse panel today. We have an African-American professor of English. We have an enrolled member. We have an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. And we have a 72-year-old white male up here. So, historical fiction. All of us, all three of us, we are all children of the South, but we approach our craft from very different perspectives, as you can see. But we do have some things in common, and our work product does too. Our books are all historical fiction, and they revolve around small town life in the rural South. For example, I'm from rural Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, in Surrey County, and I was an international business lawyer for years, but now Helen Ruth and I live on our farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Angela, her book is about Parsons, Georgia in 1936, right? And your book, Annette, is about Western North Carolina, Cherokee, and Asheville and the Grove Park Inn in 1942, when Japanese and other European enemy aliens were interned there during World War II, which all three of these things I think are fascinating stories. They all deal with social and racial and ethnic injustice, and they all deal one way or another with poverty. And I really loved one of the quotes from your book, Angela, where you say, not a one of us were rich, but we had all that we ever needed, and that was each other. Sadly, they all three involve violence, brutality, and death. And more encouragingly, they all involve church life, Bible verses, familiar hymns, and Southern funeral and burial customs. They all play prominent roles in our work. And of course, what would a Southern historical fiction novel be without food? Again, quoting from Angela's book on page 3, listen to this. The menu consisted of baked ham, short ribs, fried chicken with gravy, dressing, collard greens, stewed okra and tomatoes, potato salad, apple dumplings, buttermilk biscuits, and German chocolate cake.
You mean y'all don't all have that at your homes on Sundays?
I'll see y'all later. I'm going to go eat.
Right. But it's very funny because there are similar passages in all three of our books. But can't you just taste it now? Can't you smell it and taste it? Annette, you begin your book with a quote from a fellow member of the Eastern Band, Tom.
Cherokee Nation.
Cherokee. Okay. Well, I'm quite frankly, I'm ignorant about the difference between those two things.
Okay.
But it's Tom Belt.
Yes.
And you know who I'm talking about.
I do.
And so he didn't put it exactly this way, but if you paraphrase the introductory quote from Annette's book, you'll get a good way to start off this whatever this is, this panel discussion, where quoting, paraphrasing, that's the thing about historical fiction. It must have three things. It must be for the right reason, at the right time, and it must be in the right place. The right reason, the right time, the right place. To me, in working and completing my book, I began to think of historical fiction as sort of a time machine that transports readers to a different time and place. And readers of this genre, and I'm a big fan of historical fiction, I hope that most of you are as well. I think that readers of this genre, at least my experience has been, that they want to learn something from the book that they didn't know before they started reading the book. But they also want to know, where does the historical end and the fiction begin? What's the demarcation line between reality and imagination? So the challenge for us, I think we can agree, maybe not, but at least the challenge for me in working my way through the Tannery was integrating and weaving the rich historical detail that I wanted to put into the book, but doing it in such a way that it doesn't slow things down and it doesn't interfere with the pacing and the sense of building momentum in the book. I was guided by two fundamental principles that most emerging writers are taught, and number one is write what you know. I grew up next to Wilkes County, so that's what I knew, so that's what I wrote about. And the other is, like I said, don't get bogged down. Just tell the story. So, questions. We're going to start the panel discussion now. I want this to be very active, please. I have some opening questions, which I'll throw out to the group. But at any time, if any of you have questions, we're not going to wait till the end and do Q&A on this. As we go through things, so we can stay on point, if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, just raise your hands, and I will certainly do everything I can to recognize you. And if I don't see you, then I'm absolutely sure my wife, Helen Ruth, will correct me on this. So for my two colleagues here, how in the world did you first think that there was a book in you? How did you go from being a consumer of fiction to a producer of fiction?
Well, I think for me, and this wasn't my first manuscript, full-length manuscript that I wrote, but I think for me, it was because I cannot write short stories. Because I keep thinking of everything connected, that one life is often connected to another, and most importantly, that thematically, so much of our worlds are connected that we may not know about. So, from the perspective of that question, why a full length book? That's the reason why. And then why did I think that I would be bold enough to write a book?
What made you think that you could do this?
I don't know. I'm a little bit stubborn, I guess. And
well, you're a high school English teacher, right?
Yeah, I am.
Yes.
I am. So I'm around stubborn people all the time. No, I've never been a person to limit myself. In any realm, I don't see any reason to do that until you can't go any further, and then you just take an alternate route. So I enjoyed the process, though. So I was going to write the book, whether it got published or not. The publishing
Right.
part's, the harder part.
Right. So how about you, Angela? I mean, what in the world, what led you to that fateful day when you said, I'm going to write a book and it's going to be a historical fiction book? What made you think you could do that?
Well, I have one name that, as far as what made me or who made me believe I could do that, and that was my daddy, MC Jackson. I grew up in a rural town in Alabama, and there wasn't much to do. The population of my town was like 750 people. That's counting the dogs and the cats. And back then, we had maybe three, four TV stations. And my dad, and we had one TV in the house, and my daddy had control over it. So I had a lot of time on my hands to make up stories and read books. But he was a much older daddy. So by the time I came along, he was almost retired. But I can remember him going to work in the morning saying, "When I come back, you're going to have me a story." Because I would scribble in my little notebooks, what I thought was a story. And he'd say, "Well, when I come home, well, you're going to have me a story." And so, of course, if my daddy said, "Have me a story," I was going to have him War and Peace when he got home, if that's what he wanted. So I just got in the habit of every day, daddy would come home and I'd start off by giving him my little book. I said, "Will you read it to me?" Not realizing that there's such things called words. And so he'd look at it and say, "Oh, I'd much rather hear you read it." So I just learned, the art of storytelling, from this rural community where Saturday nights was sitting out underneath the pecan trees, listening to the old folks tell stories about the past. And Daddy was born in the 1920s. So this book is set during a time that was familiar with me, even though I was much younger. I felt a kinship to this era. And it also, when I wrote this book, Daddy had passed away. And it was kind of my way of going back to a time when he was young and alive and still vibrant.
Well, why historical fiction? I mean, you certainly could have written a memoir. You still might. You still might write one, or you could have written a book about any sort of thing about fiction. It could have been set in contemporary times. What led you both to decide that you wanted to write in the genre of historical fiction?
Well, I kind of joke that while I was writing, I didn't even consider the fact that I was writing historical fiction until I was working on my marketing plan with the press. And I know, intellectually, I know that 1942 is historical, but the themes and motifs in the book are so present day for me. There's a lot of analysis of identity and belonging and citizenship in this book, and so it felt very present and relevant for me. That I didn't think about writing historical fiction in that moment. Obviously, there's research to be done and things like that, but that wasn't my goal to set out to write historical fiction. My goal was to set out to write a narrative from a perspective we've never heard before. I'm the first published novelist from my tribe, from the Eastern Band of Cherokee. So I wanted that voice out there as part of this American narrative we have about World War II. There's so much that has been written about World War II, but there has never been a perspective from an Eastern Band Cherokee stateside World War II. So I think that it was really the themes and the motifs that carried me back into the past unintentionally.
Right. And how about you, Angela? I mean, it's Parsons, Georgia in 1936. It's not the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's not the days of slavery in the 1840s. It's Parsons, Georgia in 1936. Why then? Why that? Why historical fiction for you?
Like I said, that time period means a lot to me because, those are the stories that I was told when I was a young person growing up. So I felt comfortable in that time. I chose that time strategically because I didn't want to write about the Depression and I didn't want to write about World War II. So I thought it would be a nice little comfortable zone, if there is a comfortable zone for a Black person in Georgia. That was a comfortable zone for me to position my characters in. So I decided to focus on that time period. And the other reason I chose it was because I'd grown up reading Gone with the Wind, but I didn't know what Mammy's story was. I grew up reading, you know, um, other books with characters who were maids, but we didn't really hear what their backstory was. And then we've had stories since then written by individuals about maids, but again, I never felt like I got the true story of what I witnessed growing up with a house full of people that worked in domestic positions. And so I thought, again, like Toni Morrison says, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written, write it yourself. So that's what I did.
Well, one of the reasons why I like historical fiction is because at my age, I've lived so much of it. And my book is about 1900, but I was told by a publisher recently that basically they categorize everything written about the time period before, wait for it, 1990 is historical fiction. Is historical fiction. I was thinking, well, maybe the Korean War, maybe that would push the limit of his. No. It's evidently regarded, the categorization by publishers today is anything that's written about a time period before 1990 is pre-internet, it's pre-personal computers, basically, and it's considered to be historical fiction. But I put my novel in 1900 because I wanted to expose and bring to light some of the darker and more shameful aspects of social and racial conditions in North Carolina and throughout the South in a period of time that doesn't get very much attention, quite frankly. This is Reconstruction ended in 1877 when the federal troops were withdrawn. And the Klan was basically put out of business by the Anti-Klan Act of 1871, but they came back in the 1920s. But 1900 was a pivotal transitional year between basically the end of the post-Reconstruction era and the beginning of the segregationist Jim Crow era. I was born and raised. I was raised during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, so this all resonated with me, and I hope that this novel that I have produced will shed some light and raise some awareness about that period of time. So, how did you do your historical research? You weren't born with the detailed knowledge that's in your book, except maybe about the food.
Yeah, maybe about the food. So I am a planner. My agent is sitting there, and she knows I've probably sent her the outlines for the next 50 books that I'll be writing.
You've just put a target on this poor woman's back right
That's
here.
okay. She can handle it.
Okay.
But I do a lot of planning before I ever even sit down and write chapter one, first sentence. I really want to know the time period that I'm writing in, because what I have learned, and I'm sure you all have too, Google is a death trap for writers, because you can start off saying, okay, I'm just going to see what day of the week the Civil War started. And the next thing you know, you're looking at the mating habits of fruit flies, and you're like, how did I get there? So I put a time frame on time that I'm doing research. I try to do all the research necessary for me to be able to write consciously about what I'm writing about without having to continue to go back to books and websites and various things. So I probably spend a good 6 months to 9 months just researching a book, outlining the book, so that I know chapter by chapter what's going to happen. And then when I sit down to write, then every day I know what I'm doing, and there's no guesswork. And I know that's not sexy to some
It's
writers.
not very romantic.
No,
is it?
no.
Yeah.
Writers like the idea that you just sit down and just let it come over you. And I have a job and a demanding husband and pets. I don't have time to just let the muse find me. I have to tell the muse when we're going to have an appointment and show up on that day and time.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I
Annette?
totally agree with Angela. We can talk about fruit flies later because I have studied that as well, I think. I am definitely a planner. What was interesting about this book is that there was not a lot of historical documentation specifically about the Grove Park Inn. The summer they held Axis diplomats as prisoners of war, which was really exciting to me because as a fiction writer, I have a lot more latitude. So I did.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm a big World War II fan, and
Yeah.
I knew about the Greenbrier.
Right.
And I knew that diplomats were held at the Greenbrier in West Virginia, but I don't think I knew
Right.
that prisoners of war at the diplomatic level were held at the Grove Park.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people didn't. There was an article in the Asheville Citizen Times that was mostly talking about the Biltmore House during World War II and their role. But there was a paragraph about the Grove Park Inn. And so that caught my interest. And when local historians that I talked to didn't know about it, I knew I had something that deserves some attention. So in terms of like, I don't spend hours in an archive, sifting through material necessarily. But I do spend a lot of time with photographs of the area that I was writing about, so that I know what the road looks like in 1942 between Cherokee and Asheville, and that's important to me. I know what.
So very important in your book.
Yes.
That road between Cherokee and Asheville is well traveled.
It definitely is. And I know what the structures look like. I know what the woods look like. But that's the other thing I like about writing about where I'm from. I'm a mountain biker, so I spend a lot of time in the woods. The woods in 1942 aren't all that different than they are in 2021, in where I'm speaking from. So my research is a little bit different than maybe expected for historical fiction, because I really want that sense of place to be true. And then the other thing about writing about a rural area is that I could know what products and whatnot were available in 1942, but were they available in Western North Carolina in 1942 during wartime? So there are a few levels to try to get down to. But if I can find a human resource to talk to who lived through some of these things when I write historical fiction, that is far more valuable to me than a piece of paper that has it written down, because they experienced it, and I want my readers to experience it, not just know a fact.
Well, I have to tell you, you always hear that the devil is in the details, but I think when it comes to historical fiction, the richness is in the details, and you need to really get it right. I mean, you don't need to go to the extreme that I did. I started working I started researching this thing 14 years ago. I was full-time working as a lawyer at the time, and it was sort of a hobby for me. It was an on again, off again thing, but it was really, really important for me to get it right. And one of the things I can say is I don't know whether I can write fiction worth a lick or not. Some other people seem to think I can, but I think I'm pretty good on the historical detail. I mean, one of the things is, if you're gonna talk about Wilkes County in 1900, you better know that they did have a telephone system then, that they did have electric lights then, that they did have a telegraph system then. But you also better know that people were still getting around in horse and buggies, because automobiles didn't come to Wilkes County until 1909 because the roads were so bad. Now, that kind of explanation, those things are in the book, or not in the book when it comes to cars, but they are what provide the historical richness that I think that adds so much to the thing. Now, as far as the muse, when does the muse find you? Well, I'm an outliner too. Lawyers are linear thinkers. And so research and organization and outlining comes naturally to us. Uh, and so I didn't make much progress on my book, but boy, I had a hell of an outline. And then one day, however, in April of 2020, I came downstairs and I had a sheaf of papers in my hand, and I said, Helen Ruth, here it is. I think after 13 years, I think I've got the outline. I think I've worked out all the kinks. I think all the problems. I know why people are doing things and what they're going to say. I think this is really it. Well, my muse
Helen Ruth.
turned to me with instructions, and she said, she stood contrapposto like this, put her hands on her hips, and she said, listen, Almond, I need to tell you something. You don't realize this, but me and all of your friends, and I mean all of us, we are all sick and tired of your research. We're sick and tired of hearing about your outline. We're in the middle of a pandemic now, so either go upstairs and write the damn thing or shut up about it. So I was motivated by my muse to do just that. And so after 13 years of research and outlining, in 5 months, I put together 125,000 words and finished the book. And then less than a year later, here it is. So let's talk a little bit then about writing routines. So how do you approach your work? I'm telling you, when she sent me upstairs, I sat down and confronted what I thought was perhaps the most terrifying image I'd ever seen in my life. You know what it was? A blank computer screen. It's one thing to outline. It's one thing to research. It's another thing. It's another thing altogether to think about dialogue and plotting and pacing and integrating and weaving these historical details. But, I sat down and I finally sat down, limbered up my fingers and typed. The opening scene of the Tannery takes place in a graveyard, cemetery. So I typed, the sky was the color of sour milk. The late afternoon sun, a crystal marble burning through it. And I leaned back and I said, well, that ain't half bad. That's not awful. And so then it just began to come. So what were your writing routines as you completed your books?
Well, like Angela mentioned, I'm pretty busy. So I teach high school English, and I have two young boys, and I'm married, and we have dogs and a cat, and all of those things. So I have pretty structured, and outlines are important to me because of that. So that I know where I'm going when I have a short amount of time to write. I get up at 5 a.m. And I write, but also staying physically active is really important to me. It's important to my writing as well. So sometimes if I have a plot issue or a problem I'm working through, I go mountain biking and I write in my head as I am out in the middle of the woods constantly. And then the other thing I'll say about just having the time to write is I always have paper with me. I always have a journal or something with me. And I actually like free writing scenes first and then being in front of a laptop.
So you
before.
compose freehand.
Not fully, but to get started on a scene,
Right.
I often will start.
Doesn't it?
I will start freehand, and then I'm going too fast, and I need a computer. Like I get antsy for a computer.
But sometimes it's good to slow down.
Sometimes.
Sometimes you need to savor the thoughts, right? You can type them really fast. It's good to slow down and write them out longhand. What about your writing routines, Angela?
Well, I teach at Ball State University, so I teach primarily on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So that means Tuesdays and Thursdays are my hardworking days for myself. And I tend to get up probably about 7 in the morning, and I'll work well into the evening. And I'd make notes at the end of every writing day for what I need to accomplish the next day. So I have my grocery list of these are the research materials that I need. These are the details that I'm going to need in order to write those chapters. And then I never end a chapter at the end of a day. I always stop mid-sentence, usually
Really?
somewhere in the middle of a chapter.
Really?
Because then when I show up the next day, I know exactly where I'm going to start. There's something about what you just said a few minutes ago. There's something about seeing chapter 1 in blank that's just overwhelming to me. But if I know when I enter into my dreamland that night what I'm going to be writing about the next day, I'm already having conversations with those characters all through the night. And then when I get up the next day, all I have to do is pick up in the middle of the sentence and keep going. So
keep going.
that's my trick.
Yeah, I want to add to that because I heard an agent actually speak on that thinking about what you're writing the next morning is really helpful because when you wake up, you're still almost in that dreamlike state that you mentioned, and you kind of push right through, a plot problem or whatever it is. But it's a nice continuation from night to the morning to write.
That is so funny. I don't know anything about writing except my own personal experience. Helen Ruth gave me 6 books on creative writing 2 Christmases ago. I have not cracked the first one of them. Not the first one, but
That's not good.
It was a hint. It was a hint. It was a hint to get busy until she finally told me to go
Imagine a
upstairs.
surgeon saying, "Look, I am not going to look at Grey's Anatomy. This
All
book
right.
does nothing for me. I'm just going to get in there and wing it."
Well, guess what I did? That's what I did.
You winged it.
I did wing it, but I had a system as well because for me the pandemic was my friend. I never would have taken the time or have had the discipline to go upstairs and devote the time that I did to it if we weren't basically in quarantine on our lovely isolated gilded cage in the North Carolina Blue Ridge. I mean, we live 15 minutes away from the nearest place you can buy a Snickers bar. So, the internet was good for the book, and quite frankly, it seems strange to say, but the pandemic was as well. And my routine was read the newspapers in the morning. I got upstairs about 8:30, and I wrote straight through until 2:30 in the afternoon, came downstairs for a late lunch. I'm an only child, as Helen Ruth will certainly confirm to you. And so I'm accustomed to playing by myself. But these people that were coming out of my head and the things that they would say and the surprising things they would do, I mean, I was having the best in the world upstairs alone in my man cave writing this book. And every day I would come downstairs about 2:30, somewhere between 12 and 20 pages in hand, and excitedly hand them to Her Majesty, Helen Ruth, who would then read them and comment on them, and we would discuss them. But like you and you, there were some issues that didn't necessarily get resolved. But this is the craziest thing. It's happened to me as a practicing lawyer as well. Whenever there were problems with a case, or whenever I was preparing to cross-examine somebody, or when I was preparing to write the next chapter in the book, if there were issues or problems with it, I went to bed and literally slept on it. And I don't know how to explain this any other way than to tell you that the next morning, the issues were resolved. I knew exactly how to fix what was worrying me the night before. And every day before I wrote anything new, I would integrate what Helen Ruth and I had discussed from the day before, plus what I had slept on overnight before I began to write anything new. And I attribute this procedure to the realization that I was able basically to do my book in one draft. I didn't restructure, reorganize anything. It just went straight through. Now, some of the characters ended
That
up
must
being.
be nice.
That's cool.
I think you're getting some hints that maybe my book's not any good at all. I don't know.
No, it's that you have found a path that we
Yeah.
all want to walk on.
Yeah. Well, it's
One draft, did you say?
Yes. Yeah. One
I'm
draft.
done with this panel. It's been nice talking to you.
Well, but I didn't need to do any reorganization or restructuring. But quite frankly, some of the characters, Tink Beasley in the book, ended up being one of my developmental editors said, I like this character because she reminds me of Della Reese smoking a cigarette with her arms crossed. So she became a favorite. She was only going to be peripheral. Jewel Ponder, who was the housemaid at the Schumann Hotel, was intended to be a peripheral character. But Jewel Ponder and her daughters, Ruby, Pearl, and Opal, became more important characters. Did you find this to be true as well as you
Yeah,
wrote?
I think that definitely some characters kind of speak up and say, "Hey, why did I
Raise
just?
my hand.
Yeah, why did I just do this? You're going to have to explain what made me just do this. What was the motivation behind me acting out toward
Why would
another
I do
character?" Yep.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of my favorite parts. I had a character, the uncle of my protagonist, who completely changed my narrative because he was not about to just let me make him a villain without giving his backstory. Completely changed the trajectory of the narrative.
Right.
Yeah,
Angela?
I'm in the same boat. I have a character who is a minor character. Her name is Miss Lavinia, and she's a root woman. So she's
She's fantastic.
she's the local healer.
Yes. She's
Even the
fantastic.
regular doctors will come to her for some of her herb medicine. And I think if you're from any rural part of the country, you would go to the doctor, and then when the doctor couldn't fix you, you go to that root person that you wouldn't tell anybody about and get some herbs and teas and such. And I really thought that I liked her as a character, but I never had a vision of her going beyond this one book. But now I'm in the process of planning a trip to Ghana next year to research her backstory. So I'm very excited. So that's another hint that, a minor character, can do. I think it's like Gomer Powell, whoever thought he would end up with his own show. But
Right.
look, there we are.
Well, the Tink Beasley Show is coming to a channel near you. My grandfather, whenever I would do anything naughty that he didn't like, he would snap his fingers and look at me and say sternly, I don't want to have to get rough with you. Ain't no hands going up out there. This is supposed to be an interactive panel discussion. Here's the agent. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I have a question because I know it's something that Angela wrestled with. Is when you have characters who are not fictional, you have real life characters from the past that you need to weave into the story. How do you keep a handle on them? How do you be true to who they need to be for the book versus who they were in real life?
You've been channeling me. Next question on the list was, how did you integrate real people, places, and events into the narrative? Talk about your use of creative license. For example, some of the buildings in North Wilkesboro and Wilkesboro that appear in my book weren't constructed in 1900, but I needed them to be there. So there they are. So creative license. How do you do that, and how do you use creative license? Good, very good question.
This book doesn't have too many historical figures, and the ones that are mentioned are well documented figures, which in a sense kind of puts the audience at a distance from them. We don't know their motivations and personalities so much. So I haven't had a whole lot of experience with that. I have another manuscript that is loosely based on the character of my grandfather, and that's a little bit harder. And again, why I like fiction, because I think when it comes down to I think a lot about how somebody is going to react in any given moment, and it's really hard to do with a real life person. So, I just try to think about what is motivating them always, whether they're real characters or real people or characters. What in their past has motivated them? What can we predict based on that? And then, for me, it's places that were accurate in the Grove Park, and so I wanted to make sure that anything I portrayed about structures in the Grove Park and whatnot was accurate, but took some liberty with the details. I have to tell one story though that's so cool, because there's a room 447 in the Grove Park.
I was going to ask you if that was a real room.
So I had done enough research to know that 447 was in the historic part of the inn in 1942. And 4 and 7 are very important Cherokee numbers. That's why the room was that number. That's the only reason. And then I made sure that it existed. Well, the other day, a few months ago, a friend of mine took me to lunch over there. I hadn't been to the Grove Park since the book came out. And we decided we were going to go find the room. And long story short, we were told exactly where to go. And we got to the 4th floor, and the elevator operator pointed down the hall and said, "There's the Fitzgerald's room." And she just assumed that's where everybody goes on the 4th floor at the Grove Park. She's referring to F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald's rooms. And they apparently had 2 rooms there when they stayed there that are right next to 447. So it was really cool that a room I completely made up happened to be next to a literary hero of mine. Some things just happen kismetly, I guess.
Creative license.
I think if I was in my classroom, I could go to the chalkboard and show this to you all perfectly. But when I think of history, I think of this straight line. And when I think of historical fiction, I think of I as a writer will take detours,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
eventually I'm going to weave my way back to that straight line, which is history. So I never feel uncomfortable totally disrupting history. I will take you off the beaten path, but eventually I'll get you back to the reality of life. So, for example, Satchel Paige makes an appearance in my novel, and I researched what he was doing around the time that he made an appearance in my book, because what I didn't want is for some historian to say, well, no, Satchel Paige was playing in the Negro National Baseball tournament in Do-I-Diddy. I didn't want that. So I didn't find any evidence of him doing anything remarkable on the day that I brought him into my fictional characters'
To
lives.
Parsons, Georgia.
To Parsons, Georgia. And then after that scene, he was able to go back on his merry way and keep continuing with what was happening. Next year, my novel is set during the 1948 election. That has been very difficult because I've had to create fictional twist a little bit of what happened, but the spoiler is Truman is still going to do what Truman did. I'm not messing with the ultimate line of history. So for me, as long as I do that, I dance around, but I don't do any harm, then I'm comfortable with twisting history some.
Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
actually, because people will Google all this stuff, right?
yeah.
And there is
Boy, will they Google all of it.
the
There was no
timeline.
pizza in North Wilkesboro in 19. Well, there was pizza in North. Yeah, go ahead.
The timeline in my book, I spend a lot of time making sure that everything worked historically speaking. My husband's a bit of a historian, and I reference County's father's service in World War I, and I specifically say that it was technically after the end of World War I, but we still had troops in Europe then, right? And I know those dates, but I still get reviewers who don't actually go past Google to see, when troops left World War
Right.
One. They don't do the research sometimes, so you got to be
All right.
ironclad about yours.
All right, a question sort of getting toward the end now. We've still only gotten one question, and that's from a professional. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you have your story and your outline, the plot, you have it all come together, and you finish, and then what happens? What do you do with it?
Well, then this lady begins to go to work.
I'd just like to know each of your stories. Have you already had a publisher or?
Do you mind if I come back to that question? Because I want the panel to discuss one very important issue that I think we're all interested in, and then I promise we'll come right back to that. Okay, but it involves. I think I told you at the beginning that all these books involve poverty to one extent or another, and they all involve social, racial, ethnic justice or injustice. These become driving themes in all three of these books in very different ways, but they are driving themes. They are fundamental principles in the books. Um, and so, are these themes in your minds relevant to modern circumstances? And if they are, did you intend for them to be when you wrote your book? Or just talk about how these driving themes contribute to the impact or the hoped impact of your book. Angela?
Um, yeah, I think all we have to do is just relive 2020, and we know that the things that I wrote about in my novel are still very much relevant, unfortunately. Um, so yeah, I don't think there's ever going to be a time where we can look at society and say we've evolved. We're finished with that. Let's move on to the next thing that divides us. I think we're always going to be grappling with terms of race and gender and class. Those are always going to be a part of us. So how do we find creative ways to tackle those topics so that we don't feel shut down? So that I can sit down with your beautiful wife, Helen, and we talk about the things that we have in common, but also the things that we have that are different between us, but we still walk away from that conversation feeling heard. And
Yeah.
for me, that's what fiction has always been. I didn't feel heard in the history books, but when I sat down and I read To Kill a Mockingbird, I felt heard. I felt like, Harper Lee, you know my family. Where'd you get that from? So for me, fiction has always been the things that allowed me to sit down with my classmates, with my friends, and have deep conversations about the things that we never had in a history book or a sociology class.
Well, it's like writing about the Roman Empire. You can with confidence say the Roman Empire is over. It's done. It's in the past. But these issues, these social, racial, ethnic issues that we talk about, I think you would agree we can never say that they are in our past.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And again, that's why I never felt like I was writing historical fiction. I believe that historical fiction is a way for us to examine our contemporary life in almost a safe way, right? Or a way that it allows us to start the conversation around issues of identity and citizenship and belonging, and how we make these choices. And it just became, I think the more I wrote, the more it became relevant. Murdered and missing Indigenous women started getting national attention in the middle of this. And that was first and foremost on my mind, as well as we talk about whose voice gets heard and whose gets forgotten.
Right. Back to you. The manuscript is done. We've each typed at the end of the sentence the period at the end of the final sentence. I damn near cried when it was over on October the 27th, but we had a nice bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape that night to wash away the pain. But what happens next?
Chapter
That's
one.
your question, right?
You write chapter one, and you write the next sentence for the next book that you're going to write. If you're fortunate enough to have an agent, you let the agent do their work, and you do your work. Your work is to be an author. If you aren't fortunate enough to have an agent, you very strategically start researching publishers that are interested in taking unagented works. You start looking, if that's not your thing, if you have a gabillion friends that will buy your book, then self-publish the book and sell it to your gabillion friends. Most of us don't have a gabillion friends, so we go the traditional route. So that's sort of been how my approach has been.
And I did not have an agent, and so I would say writers workshops. Shout out to Heinemann for the Appalachian Writers Workshop, and that led to publication. But wherever you're from, find that workshop where you can get some great feedback, but also people can get to know your writing and help you place it better. Find an agent, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, this won't come as a surprise. I had a completely different experience. Authors in Charlotte who contributed to what I was trying to do said, well, now you're going to need to have an agent for this if you want to get a traditional contract, because, and that'll take you a couple of years to get an agent, and then it'll take them 6 months to read it and get back to you. And then you'll probably be a year or two before they get it placed. And then they'll put it in the queue to publish the thing. And I said, stop. I said, I'm 72 years old. I don't buy green bananas. It took me 14 years to write this book. I don't have that kind of time. And we were very fortunate to be referred. I didn't have an agent either, but I did find a very accommodating publicist who fell in love with this book, Kathy Bennett from Magic Time Literary Publicity. She said, I love this book. I want to represent this book. I want to promote this book, but obviously I can't do it if it's not published. So she made an entree with me with John Kohler at Kohler Books, and we got a traditional contract in 7 days after we submitted the manuscript, and a small advance. I might be able to take all of you for a Coca-Cola after this is over with the advance, but nevertheless, it was a traditional contract less than a year later, the book is now out.
Do not try anything that Michael has just said to you.
So there we are. So the craft of writing historical fiction. Okay, I mean, I think all of this. I begin my book with 3 quotes, and I think they have some relevance here. The first one is from Nobel Prize Southern novelist William Faulkner, when he says, in talking about the past and about historical fiction, he says the past is never dead. He says it's not even past. And then the second quote that I use is from the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says, "What has been done will be done again." What has been done will be done again. Something like that. It repeats, and it says, and it ends by saying, "There is nothing new under the sun." But the better and the more optimistic quote, particularly for books about social, ethnic, and racial justice, is from Maya Angelou, where she says, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need not be lived again." And so I think this is the lesson behind those 3 books right there, and it would be a good starting place for those of you who are who are fans of, or producers of, or wannabe writers of historical fiction. Any final questions for the good of the order?
They're wanting us to exit stage.
I know what they want.
I'm just telling you.
Are we, as the auctioneer says, are you through? Are you done? Okay.
Can we get one final
Thank you
applause
so
for our
much.
panel today?